The seventh. The seventh man wore a white beard, and around his head tightly wound white fabric. He arrived before the traveller, his face austere and stern. With eyes that spoke of the sky, of wide knowledge, and of sublime music, he looked at the traveller and bowed his head before speaking. It is for me to introduce you to the cousin of that tradition of which you have heard. This cousin, like that older tradition, was corrupted. But like some within the older tradition, there are those of us who kept alive the fount of learning, the grace of the intellectual mind and its corresponding arts. Unlike those of the older tradition, we kept that fount alive in its purity. Whereas others protected a seed by way of sullied robes, we opened the fair wood to the sun. We cut back the forest, planted saplings by the hundred. I read deeply of the old line, and sought to keep that fount alive by recognizing the twofold approach to the unity, that grace must be approached both by intellectualism and mysticism simultaneously. I held that that which ruled through guidance must be steeped in both, otherwise man would stray. As with the older tradition, the new one, from its beginning, was ruled by neither. Rather, it was ruled by the advancement and holding of power through conquest. Our cousins were already far astray by the time our founder amassed his following. I do not know from what he derived his power, for he worked great darkness in order to establish the space within which I and my followers were able to achieve our work. It would seem to me that his evil was your father's doing, as he must have foreseen already what man had made of his other works. Perhaps, as in his use of you now, your father then attacked darkness through darkness, created a creature who, by force, would gain the space that could nurture us, and we, in repayment to him, have taken the helm of learning and embraced it in all manner of direction. We reached, by way of diverse faculties, into the totality of the various areas of noble learning that characterized us. We applied our philosophy so to inform our experience. Thus we built our knowledge exponentially. We recognized that our true path was to apply our knowledge to society, to our people. That was the purpose of our studies, first to comprehend the material, then to apply our understanding to ourselves, and finally to inform the people towards true happiness. This was our duty, to heal the souls of the people. Where that path could be accomplished would exist a virtuous society, one that could be called deserving of the name of humanity, which we understand in our world to be the highest achievement of sentience. Where that path could not be accomplished would exist another, ultimately vicious society. This society would be one of three kinds. First, it could be one that has failed to comprehend the true purpose of life and has instead pursued lesser goals. Second, it could be one where the true purpose of life is comprehended but neglected due to the deceitful design of a few that led the society astray. Finally, it could be one where the true purpose of life is comprehended, but that purpose is not followed due to simple, willful abandonment by the society. Every society that we could see, around us or in our books, took a vicious form. Even the best, like that of our great forebears, followed too much in the mold of the vicious, though it exhibited more than most the virtuous. Our own society was hardly the virtuous, though it allowed for us. But though it respected us, it certainly did not follow us. We carved our space and held it for some time, but then our society was worn down by conflict with our cousins until its strength was exhausted, and all that was left was what was there before we came, belief and authority. Our people succumbed to that same disease that afflicted our cousin, though not before we had done our work. By the time our world fell, we had achieved what we needed to achieve, the passing of your father's torch to others, that the light of it could find its way forward in their world, hopefully to the destruction of that world in a new time. The traveller spoke. You and your colleagues were gifted with rare soil, and you blossomed in a way that your cousins never did. Darkness had too much pervaded their world, and thus your colleague with whom I recently spoke could do no more than submit. At least he held, as you well said, a seed in his pocket, a sapling hidden beneath his sullied robes. You, by contrast, established in your family a true line, a new blossoming of thought. And indeed, you were not tied down as others were. You had sufficient humility to see that there could be distance between yourselves and God. Likewise, you were humble enough to appreciate that you would never fully achieve what you sought. But also you were wise enough to know that it did not matter that you would die before realizing life. The seventh man responded, Others in my tradition thought to meet God as themselves, but this is not the way. I was able to see that, though infinite in all ways, the manifested universe is not made of enough to constitute must be known to know God. But though that is the case, we felt that if we are to move forward and upward, to know true happiness, and not merely the limited happiness with which most content themselves, then we must carefully examine, imagine, and then imitate. The traveller responded, I have known your work. Now I stand and dream upon this infinite road. Here is the sky, and these grasses around. I shall speak of what occurs to me now. You said your path required you to examine, imagine, and then imitate. You did well to bring the focus to the imagination. Although fundamentally important to understanding the truth of simplicity, imagination is a function often overlooked, misunderstood, and misapplied. God does not directly feed the individual mind. Only that which bears influence does this. It is what is between God and man that feeds man's mind towards good. Because of this, man must be wary of relying on his fellow men to guide, rather than his own sense of righteousness and perfection. It is too easy for men so relying to uphold the systems of control that have come to dominate man's thought. In focusing on corrupted messages of others, man has forgotten how to use his own mind, how to find perfection within his own being. Man instead, when looking within, sees but his own reflection. He views himself in the image of God, and this prevents him from seeing more. The natural world becomes merely the supplier of the resources to feed his most basic needs. Thus he fails to appreciate the representation inherent in nature of the long stretch that exists between man and God. By shrinking from what might be, man's mind prevents itself from venturing into the abstract realms where he may find the essences of life. Those essences are what exist between man and God. They are what feed the imagination with constructs to be considered and applied to life. There exists the answer to the question of the path of the Spirit. The Spirit embodies that which it has sought. Thus man may become the imitated gods. The traveller stopped speaking. Torrin saw that his eyes had closed. She glanced at the man, wondering whether he would say something, but he remained silent, as though waiting. Torrin had also read this man's books, but she had forgotten their contents, allowed them to blow away like those of all her other books with the wind on the moors. She did not recognize him, but she did recognize the thoughts her husband expressed, and saw how they strayed from the views prevalent in the village of her childhood. The traveller's eyes opened, and he spoke. My father asked me to discuss one more matter with you, man's pride and his sense of honor. On a matter of the past, one which holds relevance to your present. From this dream, therefore, take what I say. Your cousins saw pride as a fundamental form of darkness. They required the elimination of pride, but the requirement was improperly based. In order for man to follow, he could not be allowed to question, and so it was maintained that all necessary investigation had been made. Further, it claimed that all that needed to be said had been said, and all that needed to be written had been written. For the salvation of his soul, man was to follow the lead of others before and the authority of others present. It did not matter how low or how dark those others may be. It did not matter how depraved they were. They had the true word, and as long as they imparted that, their own darkness could do nothing to distort it. Men are wise to question why they should follow the lead of others no cleaner than themselves. But this is how sick men held their power, by creating a construct in which their own sickness counted for nothing. The man watched the traveller. He was reminded of a memory from his past. He asked, how did they accomplish this? The traveller continued, for man to follow the sick, it is necessary to teach man to forego pride, for no self-respecting man would so submit. Your cousins distorted the meaning of honor. Honor became to follow faithfully the doctrine of authority. Man's pride was broken like that of a horse coerced into submission. The man spoke. I remember much from that life, but not all. Do you say they believed a rider should be his horse's master? The traveller responded, two beings are in that relationship. Only when submitting to a wise and kind master does the horse blossom in his relation to man. Where his master is corrupt, the horse becomes a slave. Your cousin's institution promoted in its followers a relationship in which the servants had no voice, in which they could not question. But as any true horsemaster knows, He is not so much his horse's master as he is his horse's partner. It is true that he may choose which of several paths to follow, but in doing so he always listens to his horse's will and instinct. Only then may the two become one. Until that understanding occurs, the horse remains characterized by a diminishing spirit. As the horse becomes exhausted in spirit, the rider is left with nothing. He has broken the vehicle he was given by which to achieve his harmony. The man spoke. You are saying that my cousins broke what they needed, their pride? The traveler continued. Man's pride is precisely what allows him the favor of the gods. The man spoke. But surely man's pride caused him to focus too much on himself and not on God or that which is above him. The traveler continued. I am not speaking of pride in absurdity, but of pride in honor. Also, I am not talking of honor gained by following absurdity, but of honor gained by pursuing truth, the honor derived when the spirit is allowed to emulate essence. But not any essence, rather those existing beyond the physical and intellectual experience of man, those that exist between God and man, the essences of relative perfection. The man spoke. But if my cousins were so unwise, how were their followers so deceived? The traveler responded. They miscomprehended the nature of conflict. The universe is infused with conflict through which the sentient may arise to choose. But where conflict seems slight, a desire for conflict builds. The man spoke. But surely men crave peace. The traveler responded. Ultimately, you are right. All matter craves stillness. But the sentient being recognizes in states of relative stillness that true harmony has not yet been achieved. It is from these standpoints that men create conflict to force situations in which choices must be made. Only by choosing between two paths may man evolve his spirit. But there are two fundamental directions he can go with any one choice, towards either simplicity or multiplicity. Conflict is thus a vehicle for evolution, but for it to be a vehicle towards simplicity, conflict and the decisions made in navigation of conflict must be founded on truth. Where men have lost their inherent connection to their own souls, the conflict they produce will allow only choices resulting in darkness. The man spoke. I do not see how this caused their deception. The traveler responded. Conflict is inherent in the structure of life, and man, as a form of sentient manifestation, must embrace conflict to achieve harmony. But choice involves uncertainty, and man is vulnerable within the overwhelming complexity of the universe, and within a world of competing hostility and threat. It was that vulnerability that was harnessed by your cousins, and man in his weakness, seeing certainty, submitted himself to the abdication of his own communication with divinity. The man shifted his feet, and Torin wondered about his thoughts. She herself had felt a degree of anxiety as her husband had spoken. The traveler could sense the man's question before it came, and he waited. Eventually the man spoke. You have spoken much of our cousins, and I think I comprehend your meaning. We, my brothers here and myself, re-established a tradition almost lost. I feel that your discussion suggests that, despite our efforts to instill the importance of individual learning, the same tragedy that occurred within the world of our cousins will occur within ours. The traveler knew the patterns of man's thoughts and actions. He was his father's mind manifested to the extent of his father's will. By this he could predict the future course of this man's teaching, for he, the traveler, would not have been sent unless man was doomed to repeat his mistake. The traveler could see that man was destined to corrupt the wise teaching that had blossomed from the ground this man's tradition had provided. The traveler spoke. You have understood correctly. Your tradition shall follow the course of that of your cousins. It shall be in some ways the redeemer of your cousins' world, but it shall lose itself in the very same traps of ignorance in which your cousins themselves became lost. To Torin, the man seemed disheartened but unsurprised. The man spoke. I had hoped. I watched our seeds emerge from militant soil. I was optimistic. I tended my garden under the gaze of the sun and was given water in plenty with which to feed the young shoots. But even though I was to some extent embraced, I was not blind to the ignorance that surrounded me, which held our own doctrines too closely. In our world, unlike in that of our cousins, destruction lay at the very birth of our family. Our cousins were effective at turning a saint into a man of war. Our saint was a man of war, and his followers were hungry for their bounty. His descendants were jealous of power. That is the ground from which my ancestors grew, from which my siblings came, and on which our descendants stand. It is not surprising to me that our learning would become lost, just as our learning was lost for so long to our cousins. The traveler closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked away and across the wide expanse of grassland that stretched from the track. His eyes swept over the place where Torrens stood, but she remained invisible, a silent, disembodied witness to his dream. Emptiness. He had whispered, not even so loud as to be heard by the man before him. He turned back to the man. Do not misunderstand me. Your cousins were not those who benefited from the return of the learning that you allowed. Those who benefited were those who allowed understanding to rise above belief. The learning re-entered their world, but it was never fully accepted. Immediately it came into conflict with the doctrine that they had created and held to. The most devastating result of the existence of your two families shall be the inevitable retaliation against meaning. The new powers formed in your absence, in the realms of knowledge, will be founded upon long-held jealous belief lacking individual comprehension of God. Your families will have corrupted the possibility for knowledge to be used with wisdom. Now you may see a greater degree of the ignorance against which you fought. By acting for my father, you gave light to the world, and prevented a descent into the depths from which he came. And yet your own light was later used, just as was that of my wife's forebear, for the perpetuation of ever greater darkness. Such is the subtlety of the balance of light and dark. Take this with you when you return to what forms you now hold, that you may consider it and use it. The man had been watching the traveler as he spoke, and now bowed his head. Torrens sensed he had another question. The man spoke. As I stand here, I have no comprehension of those forms of which you speak. Am I not as I am now? What is the form of my soul, such that I stand here now as I am, with my current comprehension of a world in which I no longer exist? The traveler responded. There is an entity that accompanies each race that learns to create. He records within his mind all that has been done. With him I have spent many long years. I know you ask as to the nature of the life of your soul. The form you now hold was yours when you walked amongst men. Because of the path you chose, it is less than what you are now. Your soul was reconstituted so that we could stand here together. What you are within this dream is a part of what you are now. Your current soul is the constitution of the spiritual energy you embodied. Your mind in life was the intellectual constitution of your soul. And your body in life was the physical constitution of your mind. The energy of that which you were is now dispersed and re-embodied in other forms elsewhere. This meeting is for you just as much a dream as it is for me, for I too take relevant form wherever I must be, and never is my form the same. For you as for me, only the purpose of being remains. That purpose is to draw energy towards light. The energy you draw is of two kinds, that which you immediately represent, and that over which you have influence to the extent allowed by your own relative perfection. The man stood for a moment, and realizing that the traveler had said all that he intended to say, bowed his head, turned and walked away to take his place in the ark. The figure to his left stepped forward and approached the traveler.